Thank you very much. And Shannon, would you like to take the next 5 or 10 minutes to
Yeah.
give your
Hi.
comments? Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Paulina. That was really great. And I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to comment on this. All right. So I feel like some of your earlier work, like this, it proposes something that strikes me as incredibly true to what it's like to, I guess, engage in moral life, if we can talk like that. And that's just one of the reasons I find this really exciting. And so what I'm going to do is just sketch what I take to be the real innovation of the account of moral inquiry that you offer. And I'm also going to really briefly sketch some implications for thinking about moral testimony, hermeneutic injustice, and I'm going to raise a question. So I'm going for breadth rather than depth, but it shouldn't go for a huge amount of time. So the basic proposal is that we ought to expand our sense of what it means to engage in moral inquiry. So sometimes it is as the standard picture suggests. So sometimes it really is about trying to answer questions about the moral status of actions. But really often it's a matter of making sense of the situation, where this means like coming up with a moral map, or of gaining what Liz Camp calls a perspective. So I take it the view. I find that really key to motivating this picture is your description of the shifting nature of the moral landscape. In some ways you say, this is kind of returning to something that's very obvious, but for me it was quite key. So as Paulina says, and I'm sorry, but I'm going to read a direct quote because I like this part a lot. We're all embedded in an intricate web of duties, rights, permissions, and expectations that connect us to one another. This moral web forms the fabric of our relationships. So insofar as we care about these relationships, we care about understanding their almost constantly shifting character. So, and they're constantly shifting in sometimes really small ways, but also sometimes in really profound ways. And as Paulina says, knowing the contours of the moral landscape is crucial for understanding what relationships we stand in. So in my view, this aspect of the paper is really central because it puts a wedge between Paulina's view and the standard view. So I was thinking that without this aspect, it might sound potentially like there isn't that much of a fundamental sort of, the standard picture isn't fundamentally misguided in some way. So I could imagine a defender of the standard view saying something like, sure, we need to make sense of the moral landscape. That's totally part of moral inquiry, but that's all just a prequel to the answering of questions about the moral status of actions. It's necessary if we're going to get the right answers, and that's really what we're interested in. So the notion of making sense doesn't really challenge the standard view at all. But I take it, and I might be wrong, but I take it that Paulina wants to reject this way of making sense of her view. And for me anyway, it's not just the invoking of relationships, but also the map landscape metaphor that really enables the view to resist that interpretation. So to put the point kind of metaphorically, which again, maybe it's just me, but I found the metaphor really helpful. A map doesn't help you just figure out where you want to go. It's not just a tool that helps you figure out future action. It also helps you figure out where you are. And there's something intrinsically good about just knowing where you are. And this is something that the example of her experience makes super clear. It's really clear, like, of course she wants to know, of course, knowing what happened to her helps her figure out, for instance, whether she should report the crime, but it's also really important for its own sake. So that's sort of the key innovation to the view in my perspective, and I really liked that part. Okay, so I'm just going to talk about moral testimony really briefly because it didn't come up in the talk at all, but it's just something I've been thinking about a lot. It seems to me that if we think of moral inquiry in this way, it has a really nice implication for the debate over moral testimony. So philosophers involved in this debate are really interested in the appropriateness of relying on distinctly moral testimony, they say. And because of this, they've come to focus on assertions that are couched in so-called thin moral terms exclusively. So terms like goodness, badness, rightness, and wrongness, for instance. And they're also interested in cases where hearers don't already have a sense of the values at stake. So the hearer doesn't have a sense of the reasons for which an action might be right or wrong. And because that's what's supposed to distinguish cases of deferring to moral testimony from cases of taking testimony as advice. So they're interested in a kind of fairly narrow thing. And so they proceed by noting first, this is just setting up the debate as it exists. They proceed by first noting that we can come to know that eating meat is wrong by trusting another person's testimony. And then they note that the person who becomes a vegetarian, for instance, by trusting another person's testimony, strikes us as doing something odd or problematic. And so it seems to me that Paulina's account has a ready answer for why this would seem strange. The vast majority of the time, what we want is much more than knowledge about whether an action or a situation is right or wrong. We want to make sense of the situation. And testimony that's couched in thin terms really isn't rich enough to convey a perspective. So if that is an implication for Paulina's view about thinking about the debate over moral testimony, then it seems really similar to what Alison Hills has to say about testimony. So I guess I would be interested to see what Paulina has to say about that. In any case, I think foregrounding the importance of a Campian perspective sheds some really critical light, and I quite like the critical light on some of moral philosophy's favorite concepts. So like rightness, wrongness, goodness, badness. On the one hand, we're totally interested in all of these things, but you might think a description that's couched only in thin terms of moral goodness and badness is unlikely, at least on its own, to help us make sense of the goodness and badness of the relationships we actually stand in. So that's the moral testimony thought. So you didn't touch on it at all, Paulina, in this talk, but there is a clear connection between what you're offering us here and hermeneutic injustice. So as Fricke says, hermeneutic injustice occurs when there's a lack of shared concepts because of prejudice. I think if we take Paulina's suggestion seriously, the proposal, a friendly amendment to that would be that, well, hey, if we understand what it really means to have a concept, we'll realize that Fricke's gloss is kind of unsatisfying. It delivers the wrong judgments about certain cases. So for instance, if you imagine a society in which, like post second wave feminism, every man knows what sexual harassment is, they're not very good at recognizing when in fact something is sexual harassment. And when they do recognize it, accurately anyway, they're very rarely outraged or disturbed by it, right? It seems like these men have the concept of sexual harassment on Paulina's view. They can draw distinctions in logical space. But we also have this intuition that there would still probably be a lot of hermeneutic injustice in this world. So the friendly amendment to Fricke's gloss would be that what they really need is a new perspective. There's a lack of shared perspectives here. I feel like a defender of Fricke might want to insist that if someone doesn't feel disturbed or angry about sexual harassment, they don't have the concept. But I think deciding that question takes us into territory about how to individuate concepts and what you need in the head, if anything at all, to count as having a moral concept. And so without deciding that question, it seems to me that there's an unambiguous upshot of what I take to be could be Paulina's projected intervention. So by thinking in terms of perspectives rather than concepts, the view would open up new ways for thinking about what kinds of interventions might actually change people's views and behavior. So what we need is not really talk about necessary and sufficient conditions of sexual harassment, but we need new framings, a new set of public associations. And this might be more a job for artists and other culture workers, more than it is a job for philosophers, or at least not philosophers of a certain kind. And I find that kind of true and compelling. Yeah. All right, so I'll finish with, I guess, a question. I'm thinking about the scope of the view. So I'm thinking about whether moral inquiry, if we go with Paulina's suggestion, it would include cases of what you can just call deliberate moral retraining. So here's an example of like what I have in mind. Suppose that I've realized that with respect to a certain group of people, I tend to think and behave in pretty like misogynistic or racist ways. I realize that this is wrong and I want to change. So I need to engage in some moral retraining. My own sense is that we should think of this kind of case, this kind of deliberate moral retraining, as involving moral inquiry, in the sense Paulina offers. In this kind of case, it's not that I'm in a landscape looking for a map that makes sense of where I am, as in the Kirsten example, but I'm looking to gain a new perspective that can thereby like change my landscape. So with a new perspective, I'll be able to change the sorts of relationships in which I stand with other people. And it might sound weird to say that that kind of moral retraining is an instance of moral inquiry. We tend to think of inquiry as like a matter of discovery and of retraining as a matter of simple practice. And so someone might think, hey, in this kind of case that you've described, I just need to stop being misogynistic or racist. What is there really to discover? But it actually seems to me like this sort of retraining really does require seeking out new epistemic resources of the sort that would generate for me a new Campian perspective. First of all, it just seems really unlikely that if I constantly remind myself that the concept of autonomous person applies to members of a certain social group, then I'm actually going to succeed in changing my spontaneous thoughts and behavior. It seems like what I need is new ways of framing, new sets of associations. And so I need to go out into the world and find resources that can help me build a perspective that I can actually inhabit. And whether or not it comes with new propositional knowledge, finding that new perspective often does feel like making a discovery anyway. That's it.
All right. Thank you, Shannon. Paulina, would you like to take a few minutes to address some of Shannon's mini remarks, or would you like to hear the Adam's remarks as well and address both at once?
I'll say one thing for sure. Maybe I'll quickly say that those are such helpful comments. Thank you so much, Shannon. Have you written them up somewhere? Can you email them to me if you have?
Yes. Yeah.
And yes, so this is really, maybe we can come back to that in the discussion, but I think this is such an interesting thought, that there is a connection between moral inquiry in the sense of discovery and self-improvement, both in the ways that you think part of it is kind of retraining yourself to have new moral associations, but also in the sense that at the end of the project, you will have actually changed the moral landscape, because you will be able to form different relationships with people. So it's you're engaged, the self, we kind of think of these things as distinct enterprises. We think, oh, we discover what the right thing to do is, and then we have to kind of bring ourselves in line to it, and then we have improved. But this just suggests that these things are much more closely related, that self-improvement involves aspects of discovery, but then self-improvement involves also an intervention in the moral landscape where certain things change certain relations with other people. Yeah, so I think that's really fascinating and probably true. And I need to think about it more. I feel like I'm going probably to take, I can talk like 15 minutes in response to Shannon, but I mustn't do that. So I'll hear maybe Adam's comments next, and then maybe there will be similar themes that I can pick up on.
Wonderful, Adam. Please go ahead.
I also think that the idea of moral training is very lovely. It's very insightful. So thank you for sharing that. So I have like broadly three comments. The last comment is also on testimony, and it's also a little bit loose-ended. But my primary two comments are kind of more suggestions rather than thinking with you. Rather than, so here's the first comment, which is broadly on perspectives and the role that they play. So you sort of identify sense making with having some kind of perspective on a situation. But as Camp argues that since perspectives are tools for thought and not thoughts per se, one might question the epistemic significance for moral inquiry. So the idea might be something like this, that insofar as perspectives are just tools, quote unquote, they cannot be the kind of epistemic good that we want at the end of inquiry, or that constitutes its aim. Instead, for example, a proponent of the standard rule might say, perspectives just guide us to relevant moral answers, and these are the epistemic good that constitute the end of inquiry, because they're already inherently kind of epistemic in a way. So two thoughts kind of / questions occur to me in relation to this. So first, sort of with respect to your stated aim of inquiry of sense making, I mean, you can stress that, this is just a suggestion, like you can stress that making sense is not merely about having a perspective, a truthful thought, but having a fitting perspective, which is a thought that recurrently occur in your talk. So in a sense, you'd spell out sense making in terms of this fitting relation between one's perspective and one's moral experience, and then argue that this fitting relation is sort of the epistemically significant good that constitute the aim of inquiry. So sort of my first thing is, like, what do you make of this suggestion? And second, and in relation to this thought, in addition to sense making, you state that the aim of moral inquiry is questions or setting questions. When I understood that as kind of flagging out features that require explanation, demand attention, etc. And furthermore, since sense making is grasping a perspective that fits these features into a coherent whole, I was wondering if you'd like to say something about sort of how these three things relate, perspectives, questions, and making sense. Like, how do these three items, as it were, fit into a kind of explanatory story of how inquiry goes? So just this is my first comment on perspectives. The second comment primarily is on concepts and the difference between characterization perspectives on the one hand and concepts on the other. So I think it would be fruitful for your central idea if you sort of emphasize the various ways in which perspectives and characterizations are sufficiently distinct from concepts, and as such, emphasize how, given their different natures, they play different cognitive and epistemic roles as well. So, and the reason I think that it would be fruitful is that a proponent of the standard view or a similar view might still cash out perspectives in terms of concepts. So, for instance, and you say this on page 6, Christian arrives at it correct. It might be the case that at the end of inquiry, what Christian arrives at is a correct deployment of the relevant concept. That identifies her experience on the moral map. And so I think you can sort of capitalize on what Kemp says in her paper in terms of the features of characterizations and perspective, which distinguish them from concepts, and in particular because the features that she sort of identifies really sort of comport well with the features of the moral web that are supposed to work well together. I don't know what this relation is, but let's say it's work well. So on the one hand, the characterization are different from concepts in terms of the content. So the content is much richer in terms of the structure as well. So characterization assign salience and centrality and all of that to the features of the domain or subject matter. And furthermore, Camp argues that characterizations are sort of unstable in a way that is like they change from context to context, whereas concepts don't have this kind of malleability in a way. You should be able to apply this same concept across context. And these three features correspond well to how the moral map works, namely that they're complex. And so, you need a characterization that is sufficiently rich in their content to capture that complexity. And that the moral web is sort of dynamic. And so in the sense that there's a lot of shifting features, and then so you need to assign saliency features, and you need to assign centrality to what features are, for example, doing most of the explanation and so forth. And also, characterizations are unstable in the sense that, so in a way that corresponds to the changing nature of the moral web, changing from context to context, we bring stuff into play, and so on. On the other hand, concepts don't have the kind of content and structural features, resources that explain how we encounter moral situations. So capitalizing on that might, sort of widens the gap between you and the standard view in a good way, I think. And moreover, as you mentioned, perspectives involves kind of a wide range of dispositions and concepts. And an interesting thought that I had is, one might think that moral perspective, involves disposition to have certain kinds of affective and emotional responses. As Shannon was saying, one might have the concept of it, but then actually engaging properly with the concept requires certain kinds of affective attitudes, right? And this goes well with the recent suggestion by Vaughan Callahan that moral understanding involves and requires certain kinds of effective attitudes. So that's my second comment on concepts. My third comment, very briefly, is also on testimony. So I think if you view that moral inquiry sort of involves this grasping perspective is plausible, which I think it is, very much indeed. This, I think, has interesting implication also for the debate around communicating, how we communicate understanding. So understanding view, as Shannon described, is just all about articulating propositions and sending them off from speaker to hearer in a very kind of narrow sense. But this view is plausible only given sort of a very narrow picture of what understanding involves, making sense of it. And also given that a narrow picture of that understanding can be sort of neatly and explicitly articulated into compact propositions about random things. But if understanding or making sense, maybe they're not the same, involves perspectives, then this sort of changes how we conceive of communication in terms of its, on one hand, possibility, and on the second hand, its scope and its limits. Right? So, for instance, in order for interlocutors to come to share how they make sense of a subject, then they would need to share that kind of perspective. And namely, they would evolve like sharing the same patterns of thoughts and attentions, what is salient, what is central, etc., etc. So I was wondering if you also, like in terms of that, how would you, what sort of implications do you think this view has on, the limits of transmitting understanding or sharing understanding, propagating it, however you'd like to conceive it? These are sort of the three comments I have.
Thanks, Adam. And so, Paulina, one thing that's really nice about having recorded this is both Adam's many comments and Shannon's many comments are immortalized for your so yeah, respond as you like, and then we'll turn to general questions and reactions from the rest of the attendees.
Yeah, great. This is so helpful. Thank you so much, Adam. A lot of it I just want to take on board and say, yes, that is how I should write this paper when I'm going to be writing it. In terms of so I'll pick up on the question around testimony and the possibilities and limits of testimony, also because Shannon also picked up on that. Yes, so I think it connects obviously with the debates on testimony, and I think it connects in the sense that it shows that testimony, there's actually quite rich possibilities for testimony to communicate more than we thought, but the mechanisms are not going to be the way in which philosophers have been thinking of in terms of moral testimony. So, it's not like I will tell you a proposition, eating meat is wrong, and then you come to believe that proposition, and then there's an epistemic good that has been gained. You've gained some knowledge, and now you know it. And maybe if I tell you enough, then you will also understand it. But like if making sense is connected to understanding, then I think that can also be communicated in testimony, but it's going to be testimony that works in different ways. So like maybe, and they're like really, this is just kind of just me riffing on Liz Camp, but like metaphors are going to be really important in creating shared perspectives. Like stories, narratives are going to be important. Like comparisons are going to be really important. Sometimes maybe just like drawing your attention to certain features of the situation are going to be really important. And I think those, I think those can, I mean, it's basically like a rich way of thinking about common ground. Like those can, once I tell you the metaphor, we might come to share the same perspective, and the same, that like the same characterizations are floating around now in our minds, and we kind of recognize the same salient moral relations as salient. But what is being gained there is not exactly like a bit of knowledge. It's a way of thinking that is being gained. I mean, I think in that sense, I think that gives, in the sense, to the extent to which like effective responses are part of the package as well of making sense, I think that also gives us the possibility that like testimony can change how you feel about a situation by communicating a perspective on the situation via some framing device, whether a metaphor or a thick verb or something like that. So I think it just expands the possibilities of moral testimony. And I think that's a good thing, because when we think about how we make progress in our moral lives, and when we talk to friends and kind of hash things out, that's exactly the kind of epistemic resources that we use and that we rely on in moral conversation. Yeah, and I guess so. Just in terms of kind of whether perspectives are the right kind of epistemic good to be the end point of moral inquiry. I mean, so maybe here's a different way of putting just reframing what I've said. I said sometimes you look for questions, but here's a different way of putting it. So maybe the right way of thinking it, according to the standard picture, moral inquiry is looking for answers to questions. They're looking to questions, what to do. So WH questions. But moral inquiry also involves looking for answers to questions, how to think or how to frame a situation. And the epistemic good there is a tool. And of course, the tool has to be an apt one or a fitting one, or it's not going to be helpful. But it's recognizing that moral inquiry does not just involve the WH questions, but the how questions too. So maybe that makes it more plausible that perspectives could be the end point of that.
All right. Well, thank you so much for giving us your talk, Paulina. This was a real delight and raised some really interesting questions. Thank you too to Shannon and Adam for your comments. Those were very much appreciated. As always, it's been great. We've got a great history of having commentators who really provide a lot of constructive and helpful feedback. And Adam and Shannon, thank you for continuing that. It's not unlikely that you've all been added to the email list, so you'll be notified of future events that you can attend up. So with that, thank you. Have a good evening, and have a good weekend.
That was today's episode. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Tune in for the next episodes of Figments of the Brain on our SoundCloud page. It's soundcloud.com/brainfigments, or find the podcast on our homepage at www.concept-phil.de.